There we go. Okay. So let me get started here. Make this a little smaller so I can move around more easily. There we go. So I've been interested in creation care for a long time. And I actually got started back in the day when it was called global warming. When Al Gore came out with the movie An Inconvenient Truth in 2006, I was teaching at the American School in Taichung, teaching high school science, biology, environmental science. And one of my students asked if we were going to see the movie. At that point, I hadn't seen it, so I said, well, let me look at it first. But after seeing it, I decided not to show it in my classes. Because I found that it really, from my perspective, was not complete, that there were three even less convenient truths than Al Gore talked about. One, I thought that global warming was going to be misleading, that it was a bad name. Two, that the international agreements that he was talking about, even then I thought were too little too late. And third, that the predicted global warming models I thought were wrong. Now, two of those I think have already proven to be true. The third one, we'll see, but it's in process. What do I mean? About the name, global warming, we're talking about too small a change in temperature for most people to notice. And I said even then, 20 years ago, that it would cause people to deny the problem, and that indeed has been true. I said to my class, the most noticeable effect will be extremes of weather, and it would be better to call it climate change, which again has been adopted now within the last 5 years. I also said that the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, were only addressing carbon dioxide, not methane or other greenhouse gases. And that realistically, the targets that they were setting, given the economic constraints of the world, were going to be impossible to reach. And just the lag time from when you start to put these in place and when it finally takes effect means that no matter what, even by that point, I thought that global warming was impossible to avoid. And finally, that all the models, even now, all the models basically are linear. But almost every natural system has a tipping point. It has a buffering system. So things change very slowly until a certain point, and then they change very quickly to a new equilibrium. If you're familiar with phenolphthalein in chemistry, where you start out with a clear solution and then you add base drop by drop, and at one point it finally turns pink, and then you add one more drop and it's like bright pink. And a lot of natural systems are like this. They change very, very slowly until a certain point, and then they just jump. And there's good evidence from historical records, I mean, historical meaning things like ice cores, that such rapid changes have taken place in the course of geological history. So the current situation, I mean, you're all familiar with, I think, but carbon dioxide levels during my lifetime have gone up by 100 parts per million. Now that doesn't sound like much. When I started, when I was a kid, we learned that they were 300 parts per million. Now they're 400 parts per million. Okay, 100 parts per million doesn't sound like much, but that's 35%. If oxygen levels change by 35%, if they drop by 35%, we're talking about the equivalent of going to a 10,000 foot mountain, 3,000 meter mountain. where you have half the availability of oxygen, essentially. If they went up to 28%, then you have wildfires that can't be controlled. This is a huge jump in carbon dioxide. And the results have been the hottest years on record. The temperature has been going up steadily since 1980, and the last 6 years have been the hottest years on record. And partially this is because a small change in the average can lead to great extremes in temperature. So, you know, before you had sort of extreme cold, extreme hot, but not very much. But if you shift that average just a little bit, you get very few really cold, but you get a lot more really, really hot, meaning above 40 degrees. And we saw this in the Pacific Northwest in the United States last month, where they had record-shattering heat over the whole area. They said it was a 1 in 1,000 year event. But we've had so many 1 in 1,000 year events for the last 5 years. It's crazy. And even the polar vortex, you know, people who disbelieve global warming will say, but what about these extreme cold? That's also a result of this same event, because before, the pole, the North and South Pole, were really, really, really cold. And so the air was trapped there, just like if you put warm water and cold water together in a bottle, they don't mix because of the difference in temperature. And so the air around the pole didn't mix. But as the poles have gotten warmer faster than the rest of the Earth. There's already been a 5°C difference in the poles. And what that means is there's less difference between the polar and the temperate zone air. And so it's caused the jet stream to go crazy. And it's brought this cold air from the poles much, much further south than it did before. It's also led to much more intense storms. In Taiwan and the Pacific region, we've seen rapid intensification of storms over the past few years. Haiyan, the largest, strongest storm to hit, to make landfall. 3 typhoons in a row sometimes. You know, they just come one right after another, the same track. Germany, earlier this month, terrible flooding. Again, they said 1 in 1,000 year. Henan in China, where the subway flooded, the whole city downtown flooded. People were trapped in the subway, and they said it was a 1 in 1,000 year event. Last year in Taiwan, we had no typhoons. The typhoons all went either straight through the Philippines and into Vietnam, or they curved early and went up and hit Japan and Korea. This is very, very highly unusual typhoon tracks. All of this is related to these changes in the expected temperatures. And even yesterday, Science magazine, the #1 journal in the US, #2 in the world after Nature, said UN climate panel confronts implausibly hot forecast of future warming. What that means is that they're running numbers, and you can see the graph there. In 2013, they had models, and the models were predicting, depending on changes in carbon dioxide, anywhere from 1.5 to 4% increase or a 4-degree increase in temperature by the end of the century. And now all those graphs, all of those climate models are increasing. So the minimum expectation is 2 degrees, going up to maybe 5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And they're saying, the scientists that are working on these are saying, but the models must be wrong because that it can't go up that much that fast. But what if it does? I mean, they plug these numbers. They're trying to fudge the numbers because they don't want to believe this. But again, this is what I said 15 years ago, that at some point, it's very likely that we are going to have a very rapid rise. So this is a huge problem that you and I, you more than me, are going to be facing. And it's something that the Christian community has begun to become aware of. Lausanne Evangelistic Committee has a group called Lausanne Creation Care. And this started back in 2010 at the third Lausanne Conference in Cape Town, where 4,000 leaders from 198 countries came together for the third Lausanne Congress on World Evangelization. And part of that they came out of from that was the Cape Town Commitment, which said, we are also commanded to care for the earth and all its creatures, because the earth belongs to God, not to us. We do this for the sake of the Lord Jesus Christ, who is the creator, owner, sustainer, redeemer, and heir of all creation. If Jesus is Lord of all the earth, we cannot separate our relationship to Christ from how we act in relation to the earth. For to proclaim the gospel that says Jesus is Lord is to proclaim the gospel that includes the earth, since Christ's lordship is over all creation. Creation care is thus a gospel issue within the lordship of Christ. These are Christian leaders from all around the world that came together and agreed on this 10 years ago. And that led to a group meeting in Jamaica in 2012, and they put forth the Jamaica Call to Action, which is based on two convictions. Creation care is indeed a gospel issue within the lordship of Christ. That's quoting the Cape Town Agreement. And we are faced with a crisis that is pressing, urgent, and must be resolved within our generation. That's what I just talked about with regard to the climate change. It's a very real issue. If the temperature goes up globally by even 2 degrees, let alone 5 degrees, the consequences for people are huge. There are many areas of the world that would become unlivable. There are many crops that would fail. Water supplies would not be sufficient. This is a huge, multifaceted issue. And so they put forth 10 points, calls to action. And I want to focus on 2 of those. Number 5, that they called for action for environmental missions among unreached people groups. Just what they said was, just like in the past, we had educational missions, we built schools. We had medical missions, we built hospitals. Now we have to have environmental missions. We have to build this in as part of our evangelism, because this is what people need, just like they needed education, just like they needed medicine. At this point, they need environmental care, because the environment is going to be being destroyed. And then 9, local expressions of creation care. As we care for the environment, we show our love for people, just like medical missions or educational missions. We're ways of showing our love for the community. At this point, the best way that we can show love for the community is through environmental awareness and action. And so, again, this group has put together a newsletter called The Pollinator, which anyone can subscribe to. And there are 3 major organizations now worldwide that are involved in Christian evangelistic activity along with Creation Care, Care Creation, Aroca, and World Evangelical Alliance. And again, information on all of these is on the Lausanne Creation Care website that I posted earlier. So then the question is, what can we do locally? In July 2017, there was an East Asia Creation Care Conference in Taipei. And that brought together people from China, Taiwan, Philippines, and Japan, a few other places in East Asia. And basically we shared what people are doing. In Taiwan, there were about 20 people who attended this conference, but all of them, it's like, each one is doing their own little thing where they are. And the conference wasn't effective at drawing together like a group, unfortunately. It just sort of splintered after the conference, and people continued doing what they're doing, but there was no real coordination. A couple of years ago, I preached a sermon. I'm working with an English-speaking congregation most of the time, international students here. But a couple times a year, we have a joint meeting with the Chinese congregation. And one time I chose to speak about creation care. After I preach, I always get comments. Always people want to talk about the sermon, except this one time. This is the one sermon I have ever preached that nobody responded to. It was just like, it just didn't, nobody understood. Nobody realized the importance of this issue. And it's frustrating to me, but that's the situation. Chinese are, number one, not as aware of environmental issues as people some other places in the world. And the Christians here are not aware of how it relates to care, creation, and how that relates to evangelism. So we're really facing an uphill battle. And I really don't know how to start even. And that's one of the reasons I really wanted to do this and hope there would be more people to discuss, is anybody doing anything? And if so, what's working, or how could we do anything? I mean, it could start as simply as cleaning up a roadside, cleaning up a stream, recycling fluorescent light bulbs that right now are thrown into the trash, and all the mercury in them is going into the landfills or wherever it goes. Anywhere from that to community issues. But again, environment, it's not that big a thing here yet. People are not that aware of it, and it's a real battle. I don't know if either of you are involved, or if you have any ideas. It's something, as I say, I'm concerned about, but it really has to start with the Chinese. I mean, you have to. I'm working with an international fellowship, and I mean, we don't know the local laws. We don't have contact with the local community to say, let's get this community together and work. So I'm not the right person to do it, in a sense, but I'm the one that feels it. And so I'm going to put it out there and see what happens. So,
would you say some other countries are doing better?
I'd say individual groups of Christians in certain places are doing better. the best examples that I heard at the conference were places like Aroca, that has now become worldwide, and each Aroca is separate. It's a separate national movement with local places. Like one person in he's a minister in England, and he talked about there was like a marshy area near their church that everybody just dumped all the trash in, and it was close to the church, and so it looked terrible. And so he said, we as a church, let's clean this place up and make it a park. And they started cleaning it up, and they got the local government to declare it a park. And it changed the whole nature of that community. And as they did that, people saw this is a church, and they're working to change and improve our community, and that drew people into the church. So it definitely has potential, but it takes one local body of believers that grabs a local opportunity and says, we're going to do this together, and comes together and pulls it together to make a difference. As far as national movements, I mean, there are probably places that are doing better than Taiwan. But again, most of what is happening is still very, very localized from what I can tell. So.
And sorry. And what do you think would happen if we didn't do anything? If the climate did change? You said there'd be places that would be unlivable, crops would fail, people would have to move to Canada or northern places.
Yeah, I mean, even right now in India, the temperatures are regularly above 40 degrees. That's higher than body temperature. You cannot live in that temperature for long. And I mean, it puts tremendous strain on the resources for water. And then that leads to, I mean, the water is evaporating as well as people drinking it. So even in Taiwan, a couple months ago, it was like, I think it was May, where it was 35 degrees and higher for 2 or 3 weeks in a row. Even in Taiwan, it's getting to the point that, another degree or two, and we're up above body temperature, and it's really hard to live. It affects the elderly in particular, but everybody is negatively affected. And crops in Chiayi, they have changed the cropping pattern. They are not planting rice at the same time they used to. They are not planting pineapples at the same time they used to because of the change in temperature. They have had to change the cropping patterns. That's within the 10 years that I've lived here. So it is affecting communities, and they are responding. But most of the church is not farmers, and so we don't see that because we still have rice on the table. We don't see how much difference it's making to the people that work out in the fields all day long. So, I mean, I think that the places that this could catch on are the rural areas. Joel, you mentioned indigenous people. I mean, they are the people that are aware of this because they live in the environment. They're much more connected to the environment than city dwellers. But it is having an effect already, and it will continue to do so. Again, the typhoons. When I was growing up, I loved watching weather maps. Okay, I'm crazy, but you know, you had a regular, you had a high pressure, and then it was followed by low pressure, and that was like a V. You had the warm front and the cold front, and it just, you had high pressure, low pressure, high pressure, low pressure. They just, kept going across the temperate zone. And now, if you look at the weather map, it's not. It's like high, 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 low, 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 low. And they're all in little clusters, and nothing is moving. And that's why we get these streams of air that are carrying, it's like an occluded front, that they're carrying this huge river of moist air that then cause these huge floods in one local area. And then it moves, and you cause another flood in another area, and someplace else has drought. It is affecting the world, but city dwellers, which is most of the world, and certainly most of the policymakers, don't see that. So I don't know how to get that across to both the policymakers and the people in the church. But within, these climate change models, they're like, oh yeah, we need to do something in the next 30 years. I think we're looking at 5 or 10 years. We're going to face major change. That's my perspective. But I'm very afraid that things are going to move very quickly at some point, and we're going to be playing catch up, and that doesn't work very well. What I would really like to do, because water is going to be a huge issue. We saw that even this spring here with the drought. We really need to clean up the rivers in Taiwan so we can use the rivers and not depend on the reservoirs in the mountains. So people can use the streams and the rivers further down. Right now, the rivers, they're cesspools, they're sewers. If you walk through a city and you go over the rivers, you gotta hold your nose. That's sad, and it's entirely preventable. But it takes local people and local governments to say, we want to clean this up. And right now, the motivation isn't there. But I think at the very least, we as a church need to become aware of this issue so that when the nation becomes aware of it, we can say, we want to help, we want to do this, we want to be leaders rather than letting other people lead. At the very least, I think we need to do that. So.
Awesome. Well, I'll definitely look into it more. I need to think about how to clean up rivers. I wouldn't know how to do that, maybe.
Yeah, well, it starts as simple as, cleaning up the trash, all the plastic that's washing into the ocean. But then there's a lot of raw sewage and raw chemicals that are just dumped into waterways. And again, that it can't come from us. It has to come from the local people. But how can we convince them to do that? Maybe it's a matter of going out and walking a stream. Let's say, take your church and then walk up a stream and say, oh, look at all this junk. Look at this open sewer pipe that's pouring into this stream. You know, making people aware of it somehow. I don't know how. I just feel that there has to be something that we can do to begin to make people aware of this issue. And if we get enough of the local people, then they know the governments. They know how to to do this. We don't, because it's local laws, local government councils. So anyway. Well, we don't have any solutions here, unfortunately. So maybe we need to leave it at that point and just open to an online conversation. If anybody does see this and wants to communicate with me, my phone is there, my email address, and I'd be glad to work with anybody to either come up with ideas, or if we can at some point form a larger group that's interested in this. I can begin to get back in touch with some of the people from Taiwan that were involved in that Creation Care conference, and see if we can begin to pull things together. But as I say, at the very least, I wanted to begin to make TMF aware of the issue, because I think in the very near future, it's going to become a much larger, much more important issue that we need to face rather than it would be good to face. So, all right. So I think at this point I'll end the recording, and we'll, as I say, if people want to carry on the conversation, we can do it in whatever way.
Sounds good.
Okay, how do I stop here?